Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Today is December 23rd, the 20th of Tevis, which I believe is the yahrzeit of the Rambam. Is that correct? I believe the 20th of Tevis is the Rambam's yahrzeit. And it also, you see, we just gained the day. Baruch Hashem. Just like that, I gained the day. It is Ch10. Tomorrow is Chav Tevis. Mark, I owe you the gift. You gave me the gift of a day. Okay, today's Ch10, Tevis. Tomorrow will be Chav Tevis, which I believe is the yahrzeit of the Rambam, and I guess we'll have a chance to talk about that again tomorrow. The reason why it's on my mind is it's also the yahrzeit of two other dear members of the community who unfortunately both passed away. I'd say before their time, and so I guess we'll dedicate tomorrow's learning to them. But today we'll dedicate our learning for the speedy and complete healing and well-being for the members of our Chabura and their households, and all of Klal Yisrael, Di B'chol Asar V'Asar, wherever they may be. In particular, we'll have in mind the names that are in our WhatsApp post for a complete and speedy refuah. I'm just going to finish up sending that PDF on WhatsApp, which we discussed before we hit record. But as I do that, I want to review where we're holding. We are at the end of a Mishnah, and we're in the end of the Talmud's analysis of a Mishnah that talks about, after talking about carrying food and the relationship of the food to a vessel, and then we talked of the relationship between a human and the bed that they're on. We came to talk more broadly about the question of carrying human beings. Are you allowed to carry a human being on Shabbos? And we encountered a reference to the bill here. I'm sending it to the Talmud Chabura. We encountered an opinion that says, or a statement that says, you're allowed to carry a living person, and the bed is tafel to the person, whereas a dead person, a deceased person, one may not carry human remains, except for Rabbi Shimon, who disagrees. We discussed at length why one might be permitted to carry another person, and we surveyed a series of different perspectives, a series of different shitot about why we would give a license to carry a living being. Is it because, well, anyway, I won't revisit it now. We then went on to talk about the more painful discussion about transporting human remains. And we spent most of our time not focusing on Rabbi Yehuda, which we might say is the primary opinion that you are not allowed to carry human remains. We spent a lot of time trying to understand why Rabbi Shimon would permit the transportation or the carrying of human remains in a manner that would be desecrating Shabbos, meaning going from one domain to another. And why does Rabbi Shimon allow it? And suffice it to say, the carrying that is involved in transporting human remains, according to Rabbi Shimon, is not close enough, or it is not a valid form of malacha, because it's a malacha she'ein tzricha legufa. It is a malacha that there's something different or detached between the action and its effect, or the malacha and the way the malacha was designed in the Mishkan, or like Rashi explained, it's a situation that you really strongly wish did not exist. Malacha she'ein tzricha legufa. You don't want to have this malacha. You wish you didn't have this malacha. It's a reactive malacha. You need to respond, and that's not considered a biblical, according to Rabbi Shimon, something that would cause a person to be biblically liable for carrying on Shabbos. Of course, pater doesn't mean do it. Pater means it is not a biblical act of carrying because it has the malacha she'ein tzricha legufa. Of course, the first opinion of the Mishnah, which we imagine to be Rabbi Yehuda, says that is not acceptable. This is all to introduce us to the next step of our discussion, which is our present discussion. Or Beryl, first, do you have a comment?
Yes. How would we deal with a case that could logically occur, that the person is alive but dies along the way?
So, as I think it's an interesting question. I remember this being brought up previously. Of course, if you're transporting a person that is immortal, is in bad condition, and moving them is necessary to save their life, or then you should just do what you got to do. And certainly if a person is stuck in such a circumstance, that would not be considered a case of hoitzah per se. But if you choose to transport an already deceased person, that's where our question is. So I don't know the answer. Number one, it's not why isn't it considered carrying? let's go back a little bit. Why wouldn't it be considered carrying if you were transporting something that you were allowed to carry and it suddenly became something that you're not allowed to transport? Well, first of all, you have to have akira and hanacha. So maybe you don't have a uprooting, picking up, and then placing down. But second of all, you have this whole situation. Most likely, you should finish caring for the person and be certain that they are no longer among the living before.
Rabbi, I'm more interested in the general principle of something changing along the way, and I think we had that when we discussed the foods or the seeds, that something can happen along the way.
Yeah, that it became swollen or larger. So let's go. We can revisit. What I would say is let's not discuss that now. We can try to revisit. It wasn't long ago. It was a few pages ago. We can revisit it another time. But suffice it to say, our core discussion about is carrying a human remains considered carrying or not, that was the subject of a machlokes. Rabbi Huda says you may not carry it. Rabbi Shimon says you may carry it, and it's not Rabbi Shimon's unique viewpoint on handling of human remains. It has to do with his viewpoint of melacha she'ena tzricha legufa and the way he applies it. One more point: we had a story in the Gemara, the anecdote in the Gemara that told us that if a person passed away and it was in a way that was bringing discomfort, shame, or other emotional anguish and distress to the living, and Nachum Bar Yitzchak, I believe it was, permitted the moving of these remains when challenged for allowing such an act. He explained that this is utterly permissible because this was the transportation, the movement of human remains, not from a Rishus Hayachid to a Rishus Harabim, but rather movement into a Carmelis, and when there are no other options, that is permissible. When we looked into the halachis who are really summarizing the further commentary, it becomes evident that it would be best if the living are able to move elsewhere. But in the event that that is not a viable option, well then, for dignity, for kavod habrius, one would be allowed to transport those remains, but only because the act fundamentally is a rabbanon, and so there are places where this rabbanon is given a waiver. That was all we discussed until now. Yesterday we started talking about saras, and it felt like the saras came out of left field. As we'll see soon, it's related to the topic and the discussion in our Mishnah about the transportation of a volume of a human remains that is the size of an olive, and why a person is liable for transporting such a volume, and it'll end up, as you'll see soon, it'll end up being connected. This is it's a short segment of the Gemara. It demands a little bit of our imagination, but after what we've gone through these last few days, Shnaim Shasu, joint malacha, carrying jointly, and our scholarly discussion on malacha she'ena tzricha legufa, I think we got this. And so I'm going to share the screen, and we'll continue through the Gemara. And Reb Beryl, it's not going to be today, but remind me, it's a good question, and we should refresh our memory. And it wasn't long ago that we talked about something that became reconstituted in the middle of a process. And you're right, it may be a good analogy to your question of a person who passes away in the middle of transportation. But let's hold off on that till we have a moment to do a little research. Lastly, I'm going to end a few minutes early. I have to pop into a bar mitzvah today, so we'll probably end 10-15 minutes earlier than usual. So I just want to give you the heads up. So here we are. Tanan Hasan, we learned in a Mishnah. We started this yesterday, and we're talking about saras. And we talked yesterday that there are certain indications that tell a person or allow the Kohen to make a determination if one has saras. Sometimes it's the type of skin, a certain raw kind of skin, a se'es. Sometimes it has to do with the white tone of the skin or white hairs appearing within this skin malady, which is referred to biblically and in the Mishnah as saras, and as we choose to somewhat awkwardly translate as leprosy. It's awkward because it's not quite leprosy as we know it, although, well, anyways, but suffice it to say, it is this kind of skin malady, and it's a concerning skin malady that would lead to, and a spiritual kind of malady that could lead to a quarantine, not unlike the treatment of actual lepers in the ancient world. So anyways, what if a person manipulates their skin in the place where they have a suspected case of saras in order to avoid being subject to the laws of saras, quarantine, atonement, offerings, whatever that process is? So it is prohibited to do so. And we looked yesterday in the Chumash where it says, Yishamar lecha minega saras, be very careful to observe, to guard, to uphold the tsaras, and therefore one is not allowed to tamper with their own body in a way that would help them avoid being being diagnosed with tsaras. That's straightforward. That everybody agrees. Where it gets complicated is what if, for example, a person has 3 hairs, which is more than the necessary 2 hairs to be committed, which is more than 3 hairs, which is more than the 2 hairs that would make a person still considered to have tsaras. So if you pluck off a 3rd hair, but 2 remain, the person can still be diagnosed as being a mitzora. And so therefore the Gemara's question is, or the discussion of the Mishnah and the Brisa here is, would removing a hair when there are 2 remaining hairs, and therefore a person can still be diagnosed, would that be considered a prohibition of Ishomer to upkeep and guard the tzara? So let's look inside. Hatoilish simane tuma. One who plucks white hairs that would cause a person to be diagnosed as having baheres tzaras. Or a person who burns a certain raw type patch of skin, which is potentially a se'es. They transgress a biblical prohibition of not tampering with tzaras, and Rashi quotes us the verse that we took a look at in depth. Hishomer b'nei tzaras. Now is where it gets complicated, as I previewed. Itmar. Here is a machloikes presented. Achas mishtayim, a person has 2 white hairs, and he plucks one of them out, and is now no longer able to be diagnosed as having tzaras. Chayiv, he has violated the prohibition of not tampering with his tzaras. Rashi, the shakla letuma, for he avoided the tumah of tzaras. She'ein mitama v'paches mebeis, a person will not be diagnosed and will not have the tzaras treatment if it is less than 2 hairs. And this is the limud that we find in Vayikra Seyar Shnayim v'Chayiv Malkis.
Once he's diagnosed, can he pull him out then? If it all depends on the diagnosis.
It's not just the diagnosis, because then the person has to, in order to be
he's
healed.
He's tummy. So,
yeah, but in order to be healed of tzaras, there is further inspection of the affected area. So long as a person is under observation for tzaras, I believe they would not be permitted to tamper with their
Rabbi,
symptoms.
It's
yes,
also it's also very important that he be isolated for what happens to people who come in contact with him.
So the halachic I should say the biblical notion of tzaras, to my knowledge, is not contagious as leprosy is contagious. It was more of a spiritual, it's understood to be more of a spiritual issue. And so the quarantine, generally speaking, is understood to be part of a spiritual teshuvah process, especially with the teachings that tzaras is connected to Lashon Hara. And so a person is given a chance to sit in timeout, if you will. And again, it gets a little more complicated when we read the story in Tanakh about the 3 lepers that were together. And so do lepers have to quarantine from one another? But suffice it to say, generally speaking, the understanding it's not so much a factor of contagion as much as part of the teshuvah and purification process. So in the halachic text that's based on Parshas Tazria, it describes there that 2 white hairs is what would make a person impure, and by plucking it out, he would avoid potentially being diagnosed with tzaras, but he would be in trouble, so to speak, for transgressing a prohibition of tampering with tzaras. So if you have 2 hairs and one is plucked, everybody agrees that's a problem. Where it gets complicated is achas mishalesh. He plucks one of 3 hairs. What's complicated by 1 of 3 hairs? Well, Rav Nachman says chayiv, amar chayiv. Rav Sheshes amar potter. Rav Nachman says one is chayiv. Rav Sheshes says one is potter. And the Gemara is going to explain the reasoning for each opinion. Rav Nachman amar chayiv. Why does Rav Nachman say that for plucking one of 3 hairs, you're chayiv. Ahani masov, ultimately his actions can directly contribute to him being purified. Why? If one of the other hairs fall out, he now will be absolved of the tumah. And so he has brought himself closer to a potential situation of tahara. Rav Sheshes says, no, he's pater. The moment you plucked out the hair, the person remains in a tameh status, and therefore this very moment, his plucking of that extra hair has done nothing. The person has many more hair, then it's plausible, it's reasonable that he would yet not be in trouble for plucking out one of them. Now, if Dr. Hammer was here, we would probably discuss the fact that some people have challenges. You tell a person not to touch, a person has a scab and you tell them not to touch it. Some people are going to be extra inclined to touch the place that they're not supposed to touch. And so one could envision a scenario where this could be very challenging. So we should concede that fact. But ultimately here we're talking about, I don't mean that only Dr. Hammer would bring it up, but I could imagine that this is something that he would bring to the table. And so we should entertain that. It's probably a big challenge. It's probably not easy. Maybe they had special pouches or things that they could put on top of the skin so you don't mess with it. I don't know what they had in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, but suffice it to say, removing one hair, it doesn't directly cause a person to not be able to become tamei. Therefore, Rav Sheshes says pater. Rav Nachman says no. Ultimately, this is considered tampering with the symptoms, the evidence of the tsaras. Interesting. This is a machlokes. Anyone want to try to brainstorm some kind of suvara, some kind of deeper explanation between the machlokes of Rav Sheshes and Rav Nachman? What's the crux of the debate? Well, the Gemara is going to do that in part.
You pull out 2, or the thing is always pulling out 2. Usually it's always 2 of everything to be chayav. To
be not chayav, but to be, you're saying usually, yeah, but here we're not looking at the act, because this is not a Shabbos act yet. Yeah. This is an act of tampering with your tzaras. So the question is an indirect, maybe what we're saying is an indirect contribution, is an indirect effect considered direct enough to be chayiv? Or do you have that kind of plausible deniability? Lamaisa, your action didn't tamper with your status. And if you're and
you extend that, if there were 3 hairs, it's okay to pull out 2.
No. There are 3 hairs to pull out 2. Everyone would agree is a problem. One is not allowed. Everybody can agree that you're not allowed to go from a potentially tamei to not tamei. That's
if you have 3 hairs, you pulled out 2, you'd still be tamei, right?
I'm sorry.
Or whatever
if you pull out. Yes, so if you have 3 hairs and you pull out 1, you're still tamei. You pull out 2, the person avoids.
Out 1, then you would go from tamei to tahara then.
Yeah, well, yeah. Or I don't know if the word is tamei to tahar, but the Gemara uses the word tamei. But the point is you're avoiding diagnosis. Right. And that's not consistent with Hishamer B'negat Saras upguarding the Saras.
So then if there were 3 hairs, it would be okay to pull 1, or would it? For sure.
I'm sorry, again.
If there were 3 hairs and you pulled 1, there'd be no shaila because there's still 2 remaining.
Yeah, yeah. It seems so. The shaila and I think, Mark, what you really were trying to ask, I think, is what happens if you have 4 hairs and you pluck 1, and so there's a little bit of a buffer between the effects of your actions and because there's still an option for 1 hair to fall out and you still be tamei. So
Rabbi, we could see why this problem exists. Nobody's going to be proud to have psoriasis.
Yeah, no, anyone would like to avoid saras. Saras was not like a, today, sometimes, in the beginning of COVID, people were exposed and they had to go into quarantine and it was like a relief. You could take a vacation. But I don't believe that was the case in the time of Tzaras. And also it underscores one of the big distinctions. Please don't take this the wrong way, but there's a big debate about locking down or not. And one way of understanding the different sides of the machlokes is very simple. People who can work remotely and don't have kids at home, we're very happy to have a lockdown because it meant they get to be in a quiet, relaxing workplace. They don't have to put on their pants in the morning. They can go to work and Shalom Yisrael. But people that work manual labor, to be told they have to lock down means they can't go to work. Or people that have kids at home, it means that they're sitting and they have to keep their kids home. So a lot of times the machlokes isn't exclusively hashkafic, but it's also that people fail to take into account the circumstance of others. And anyways, it's one of the delicate topics that are not mine to discuss, but we're talking about if a person wants to have tzaras or not, a person wants to go into quarantine. So that is certainly an item that's up for consideration. But now let's find how this connects to our Gemara, to our Mishnah. Amar Rav Sheshes, who is the one who stated that Potter, even though he may indirectly contribute. I'm sorry, I jumped the gun. Here, let's take a fast look in Taisus. Ahani Masa of the Mishnah L'Chada. Ba'achas mi arba, but in a case where it's one of four, the Mishnah L'Chada Achrit in Amalei Azal Latuma, where the removal of one hair would still give ample buffer between diagnosis and not. Kuli Almamoida the Potter, everyone would get on board and agree that removing that single hair is Potter. Because that would be akin to removing a small piece of we'll see soon. This is where it gets connected to our mission. So anyways, that's the answer, Mark, to your question, I believe. Amar Rav Sheshes. How do I know that a person is exempt if they remove one hair, but two hairs still remain? The Tanan, there's a Mishnah. That's a good analogy to the question of Tzaras. Our Mishnah. What's our Mishnah say? A person transports, removes an olive volume of human remains or an olive volume of an animal carcass. Chayev, they're chayev. When I say kizayis, the volume that contributes to impurity, you're chayev. What can I infer from here? Hachatzi zayis pater. If the volume, the size of the human remains, are less than a volume of an olive, and you choose to carry it, you should be pater. You should be pater. Why? Because for the purposes of purity and impurity, anything less than an olive size doesn't ruin your day. It's probably not the most wonderful or appetizing thing to have, God forbid, a piece of human remains around. Although again, those that have gone to medical school may have more relatable scenarios of human remains. But suffice it to say, for the purposes of Tumah and Tahara, less than a zayis, no ritual impurity is conveyed. And therefore, for the purposes of the halachic conversation, there is no compelling reason to remove it. Being that you have no value, no incentive to remove it, well, then that's not considered carrying. It's not the minimum shear that makes it chashuv, that makes it something of significance. That's what we learned in our Mishnah. Vatanya, there's a brisa that seems to give a very different perspective. There's a brisa that says chatzi zayis chayiv, transporting, or I should say removing half a volume of an olive makes one liable. You're chayiv for carrying it. My love, so Rav Shesha says, what's the difference? Why is there, how do we understand the apparent contradiction between a Mishnah that says less than a zayis, you're chayiv, and a brisa that says half a zayis, I'm sorry, less than a zayis, you're exempt, and a brisa that says less than a zayis, you're liable? My love, surely here is the explanation. Hadatanya chayiv. When we say chayiv, the afik chatzi zayis mikazayis. You're removing half of the volume of an olive from an olive-sized piece. Therefore, by removing half a volume, you're making the other half not convey tumah. So you meaning if you want to avoid tumah, you want to downsize the zayis volume to less than a volume, less than the size of an olive. So essentially, what are you doing? Rashi, The shakli of v'shiura, you're shrinking it down to be below the measurement that conveys ritual impurity. Therefore, you're chayiv because you very much want to remove this volume, this half olive volume, because it's making your house a pure zone. Your house is no longer a place where your kohen can't go. And if you're an Israelite, you'll have to go to the mikvah and wait and be purified before going to the Beis Hamikdash. And so there's a strong incentive, a strong desire to remove that olive volume. The Hadatan Potter, our Mishnah that says you're exempt. The Afi Chatzi Zayis, Mechazayis Umechsa. We're talking about a scenario where you removed half a kazayis from human remains that were the size of an olive and a half. And so your removal had no immediate halachic implication. Oh, does anyone understand how this relates to the tzaras? The analogy of two hairs make you tameh. One hair makes you not tameh is the same as a zayis makes you tameh. Half a zayis removed makes you no longer tameh. So to remove half a zayis is like removing one white hair from two hairs. But to remove half a volume of an olive from an olive and a half is like removing the third hair. The tumah remains. And so Rav Shesha says, from here I might be able to impose into these two apparently contradictory texts my principle, so long as you aren't directly and immediately altering the purity status, you are tahar, you are exempt. You're allowed to carry half a volume of an olive, and you're allowed to pluck a hair if there's two more hairs remaining. That's how Rav Shesha seems to be explaining this. Rav Nachman says no. Both scenarios where you're removing a part of a larger whole, you are chayiv. Because even if you aren't immediately altering or changing the balance of tumah and tara, you are contributing to the possibility of the situation being changed. But there's a big question, but hold off on the big question. You're probably thinking of the question too. But let's take this explanation as presented. So then why does our Mishnah say that one is exempt? We're talking about the removal of half a olive volume from a large mess. And so that removal of that little piece of human remains does not at all contribute or does not at all alter the balance of Tumah and Tara.
Rabbi.
Yes.
So if I understand what they're discussing here, this is a big principle. Never before did we ask, how did you get to the minimum that you find or you have? That could hold to everything else from the last 3-4 days of discussion.
Yeah. In other words, there's the discussion here that we're talking, and there's a little bit of a problem, which I don't have the time to develop properly with you today. In the analogy, in the comparison between removing a shear of Tumah and Tara, which is affecting Shabbos liability, and the prohibition of not tampering with Tumah and Tara by Tzara. So there's a big issue that we need to revisit tomorrow. So I'm just putting it out there. But suffice it to say, the general question of how impactful or where do you get in trouble? When you alter the balance of Tumah and Tara, or when you come to the line? Because a buffer zone, an extra security is always better than no buffer zone. So 3 hairs is a buffer zone from 2 hairs. When there's only 2 hairs, you're right to the line. And the same might be said about the azayis or half azayis of human remains. And so in an interesting way, we have a comparison between our Mishnah, the discussion of a volume of a mess versus half a volume, and the question of tampering with saras. This is a stretch or a connection that I would not have thought of on my own. And yet, the Gemara does a fantastic job making this comparison.
I don't understand. Why it makes a difference why does the Gemara say makes a sin about a large mace?
Because
Chatzi zayit is a chatzi zayit. It has no relationship.
Because we're looking at the chatzi zayis with one perspective. Does it change the balance of Tumah and Tara? So if all you have is one olive, cut it in half, and now all you have is half of an olive. That would be like taking something that's tummy and diffusing it, and now it is not tummy. That's kind of like pulling one hair out of a two-haired tzaras. Half the volume changes the balance of tuma and tara. But if you have a whole entire corpse, then a small amount of that, and again, I know this is not appetizing or something we want to visualize. Well, you're not having a significant impact on this thing being impure, because a small amount. Doctor, you're muted.
I still don't understand what relevance it has the size, because you can tell me a hairy person or a person that doesn't have many hair. So it's not a question of if he's hairy or not hairy. It's a question of how many hairs two constitute.
Correct. So the person has many white hairs in this, or like Tosfos says, 4 white hairs. So then removing one hair doesn't bring you to the edge of tum and tara, and therefore we're not concerned about it.
I
so
understand.
The same thing. So removing half a volume of an olive from an olive makes it tar. Removing half a volume of an olive from an olive and a half doesn't make it tar. It just brings you to the line, to the border. Any further manipulation
I'm missing something, because I'm missing what difference does it make the reference to a large person or a not large person? It's a question.
No, we're not talking about a large person versus a small person. We're talking about
it says a large mace. It says mace gadol.
Right. Does the removal bring us to the border of tuman? Does the removal of this piece of human remains bring us right to the edge of tuma or tara? Does it bring us right to the border? Does it bring us right to the cutoff? If it does, well, then that would be consistent with Rav Nachman's desire to avoid getting to the almost. Getting almost to the edge, getting almost to the place where you make a difference. According to Rav Nachman, that's already too dangerous. You're getting too close to the line of changing the balance of tuma and tara.
So, Rabbi, in a sense,
hold on. Hold on, Rabbi, one second. Maybe someone can explain. Can someone else try to explain this? Because I'm failing to properly communicate this distinction.
I think the question now is, how did you
hold on
get
before
to
the question? Before the question, can we explain?
From the way I understand it is this way. It's a question of, if once you reduce it to a chatzi zayis from a zayis, it changes the tuma and tara issue.
Yes.
That's a fact. If you the same thing with hairs. If you have 2 hairs, you are tummy. If you remove 1 hair and there's only 1, you're not tummy. But what bothers me is the reference, and I can't see it on the screen right now, where it says mace gadol. What difference does it make the size of the corpse?
So hold on. So let's back up.
It's not a zayis of the size of the corpse.
So let's back up. So 2 hairs is like 1 zayis, right? It's the shiur that makes impurity. 3. So what would be the analogy of 3 hairs in the human remains? What would be the analogy?
Zayis and a half.
A zayis and a half. The zayis and a half is the buffer. The half is like the extra on top of the smallest shiur. Just like 3 hairs, the 3rd hair is a bonus hair. It's an extra.
But it's not related to how many hairs there are in total.
But it is.
I mean,
but again, now if there are many hair and you only remove 1.
No. I mean, in general, it makes a difference as how many white hairs there are.
Right, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about white hairs.
But it doesn't make any difference how hairy the person is.
Correct.
So the same thing with the chatzi zayis. I understand the chatzi zayis. I understand the zayis. But what difference does it make if it's a large person or a small size person?
Because because taking half a zayis away from a zayis and a half brings us very close to a change dynamic. But taking half a zayis away from the entire volume of a human body, that little volume does not change the story of two.
We are doing who's on first over here. We're going in circles.
I know, but you're saying you don't understand, and I don't understand what you don't understand. So I'm trying to understand it.
Exactly.
Because I have a feeling that what you don't understand is actually big chachma. Because in my experience, usually if you don't,
No,
no,
I don't know. I mean,
right.
it's maybe very simplistic what I don't understand.
What
But
do you do with a person who's all gray and the hair is all white?
That's a question about Tuma, about Saras that we have to look at in the laws of Saras. It's an interesting question. Just to add, generally speaking, the hair that we're talking about hair growing in a kind of skin malady that otherwise doesn't have any hair. But anyways, let's go back to our question over here. So 10 hairs means that one hair removed doesn't bring us anywhere close to trouble, right? Because there's still 9 hairs, which makes you, which is 7 hairs away from altering the Tuma and Tahara balance, correct? Dr. Stamler, 10 hairs makes us very far from straddling the border of Tuma and Tahara, correct?
right,
And a massive corpse is so much more than the minimum size of human remains that conveys ritual impurity that even if you were to remove a little bit, you're not bringing us anywhere close to the edge of the balance between Tuma and Tahara. 1 olive is Tameh, less than an olive is Tahar. To take us down to the edge gets us into a danger zone, gets us into a consequential space. But the removal of a small amount from something very big doesn't get us substantively closer to a Tuma Tahara situation. And therefore, it's not impactful. Therefore, there's no reason and there's no incentive to remove that volume. And because there's no incentive to extract a small amount of human remains from an entire corpse for the purposes of Tuma and Tahara, it's not considered chashav for transportation on Shabbos. That's what we're saying. That's the analogy. But I understand, generally speaking, the trouble of the analogy between tzaras and human remains, because I'll explain to you why without giving the answer today. Maybe we'll pick up tomorrow. Tzaras, there is a biblical prohibition that says do not mess with tzaras. With Tuma and Tahara, it's a different question. It's a question of the chashivos, the significance of the substance here and your desire to remove it because it creates impurity. But the question is a question about Shabbos. It's a question about is what you're carrying something of substance. And so the analogy isn't so perfectly aligned. And that's, I guess, that's the big issue. Dr. Rebel, and then I have to leave in 1 minute.
I see a huge problem here because the next question is going to be, what's the size of the olive? You know, you have a big range within olive. Let's say you pick the biggest one.
Rebel, no, can I cut you off just because I gotta go? No, we are assuming that there is a standard. There is a standard size of an olive, and that is the standard size that we're talking about. We're assuming that you went to the Judaica store and you bought yourself a little measuring thing. That's the volume of an olive.
But we had the cucumber, which is a large vegetable that sticks out of the basket. I mean, the minute you start defining the minimums, okay, go enjoy the bar mitzvah.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful day. Don't worry. The good news, folks, is as soon as we just close out this Mishnah, we're going to be at a new Mishnah, which talks about an entirely different topic, very different than our previous discussions. And I want to thank you all for being here and have a great day. See you tomorrow.